It started with the diesel roar of a backhoe tearing through my azaleas at 7 a.m. on a Saturday. The HOA president didn't just want a new community park. She wanted a legacy, and she decided my backyard was the perfect canvas for her vision, ignoring the property lines entirely. She thought a retired man with a cane was an easy target, someone who would roll over to avoid conflict. She didn't know I spent 40 years as a land surveyor, and the documents sitting in my fireproof safe were about to turn her construction project into a demolition site. If you enjoy seeing arrogance dismantled by cold, hard legal facts, you're in the right place. The vibration came first. It hummed through the floorboards of the master bedroom, rattling the antique water glass on the nightstand until it danced against the coaster. Arthur Penhaligon opened his eyes, staring at the ceiling. 6:58 a.m. on a Saturday. He rolled over, wincing as his hip joint popped, a souvenir from a fall on a construction site in '98, and grabbed his cane. He didn't need to look out the window to know what a Caterpillar 420 backhoe sounded like, but he needed to know why it sounded like it was parked in his azaleas. Arthur moved through his house with the slow, deliberate economy of motion that defined his life. He bypassed the coffee maker, putting on his robe and stepping into his slippers. He walked to the back sliding glass door, pulled aside the heavy curtains, and felt his blood pressure tick up a notch. There, in the wooded strip of land that buffered his property from the cul-de-sac behind him, yellow machinery was tearing into the earth. A large oak tree, one he had measured himself when he bought the lot 30 years ago, was already leaning precariously, its roots exposed like severed nerves. Arthur unlocked the door and stepped out onto the patio. The morning air smelled of diesel exhaust and pulverized pine. "Hey!" Arthur shouted, his voice gravelly but projecting well enough. "Cut the engine." The operator in the cab, a young man wearing heavy ear protection, didn't hear him. The bucket slammed down, scooping up a mouthful of Arthur's topsoil. Arthur walked down the lawn, his cane sinking slightly into the dew-softened grass. He waved his arms until the operator caught his movement. The machine idled down, the roar dropping to a chug. "You're on private property," Arthur said, standing close enough to smell the grease on the hydraulics. The operator slid the window open. "Work order, buddy. HOA, contracted. Talk to the lady in the vest." He jerked a thumb toward the street. Arthur looked past the machinery. Standing on the sidewalk, holding a clipboard and wearing a neon safety vest over a floral blouse, was Brenda Miller. Brenda had taken over the HOA presidency 3 months ago. She was a woman who used the words synergy and community value as weapons. She was currently pointing at a clipboard and nodding at a second man holding a chainsaw. Arthur marched over to the property line, or at least where the property line used to be before the backhoe erased it. "Brenda," Arthur said, keeping his tone level. "What is this?" Brenda turned, feigning surprise. She adjusted her glasses, offering a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Arthur, good morning. Isn't it exciting? We're finally breaking ground on the Zen Garden and Pavilion. It's going to raise property values by at least 4%. "You're digging on my land," Arthur stated. Brenda let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Oh, Arthur, don't be silly. I checked the maps. This is Common Area B. It's been underutilized for years. We're just reclaiming it for the community." "You checked which maps?" Arthur asked, his grip tightening on his cane. "The community plot," she said, waving a hand vaguely. "Look, I know change is hard, especially at your age, but we need you to clear out these flower beds. They're interfering with the foundation footprint for the gazebo." "I'm not clearing anything. This is lot 42. My property line extends 20 feet past that oak tree you're about to murder." Brenda's smile vanished, replaced by the look she usually saved for people who left their trash cans out past 6 p.m. "Arthur, stop obstructing. We have a permit, we have a board vote, and we have a schedule. If you continue to harass the workers, I'll have to issue a citation. And you know the fines for harassment start at $200. She turned back to the foreman. "Go ahead and take the tree down. We're losing daylight." The chainsaw roared to life. Arthur stood there for a moment, watching the sawdust fly. He realized 2 things instantly. First, Brenda was completely, arrogantly wrong. Second, arguing with her here, without the paperwork, was useless. She didn't respect logic. She only respected power. He turned around and walked back toward his house. "That's right. Go have some tea," Brenda called out after him, her voice sickeningly sweet. Arthur entered his kitchen and locked the sliding door. The noise outside was deafening, but his mind was quiet, focusing on the task ahead. He walked past the kitchen, down the hall, and into his study. He knelt before the large, fireproof safe in the corner. He spun the dial, left to 14, right to 32, left to 05. The heavy click of the tumblers was the most satisfying sound he'd heard all morning. He reached inside and pulled out a leather tube, cracked with age. Inside were the original, stamped and sealed linen blueprints of the subdivision from 1982. He also pulled out his field notes from the day he had double-checked the pins himself in 1990. He unrolled the map on his desk, smoothing out the corners. He grabbed his architect's scale and a magnifying glass. "Common Area B," he whispered to himself, finding the location Brenda claimed she owned. He traced the line. He checked the deed reference numbers. He looked at the coordinates. A cold, hard smile touched his lips. Brenda wasn't just wrong. She was trespassing on a fee-simple lot with a recorded warranty deed, and she was building a permanent structure on it. He reached for his phone, but not to call the police. Not yet. If he stopped them now, they'd just pay a small fine and move the fence. No, he needed them to commit. He needed them to pour the concrete. He picked up his journal and wrote down the date, time, and the conversation verbatim. Let them build, Arthur thought. Let them spend every dime in the reserve fund, and then I will make them tear it out by hand. The monthly meeting of the Oak Creek Homeowners Association took place in the basement of the local library, a room that smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. The fluorescent lights hummed with a frequency that seemed designed to induce headaches. Arthur sat in the back row, his cane resting against his knee. On his lap sat a single manila folder, neatly labeled Lot 42 Survey Data. He wasn't here to make a scene. He was here to offer them an off-ramp before they drove off a cliff. At the front of the room, sat behind a folding table draped in a cheap plastic tablecloth, was the board. In the center sat Brenda Miller, wielding the gavel like a scepter. To her right was Jerry, the treasurer, a man who sweated profusely and agreed with whatever Brenda said. To her left was Susan, the secretary, who was currently typing furiously on a laptop, likely transcribing Brenda's monologue. "And so," Brenda announced, her voice amplified by a portable speaker system that was turned up slightly too high, "the Zen Garden project is officially underway. We are already seeing great progress. I know some of you are concerned about the noise, but progress is never quiet." She chuckled. Jerry chuckled. The rest of the room, about 12 weary homeowners, stayed silent. "Now we move to the open forum," Brenda said, checking her watch. "Remember, per the bylaws, each member has strictly 3 minutes. Susan is keeping time." Arthur stood up. He adjusted his blazer and walked to the microphone stand in the center of the aisle. He placed his folder on the music stand. "State your name and address for the record," Brenda said, looking over her reading glasses, feigning ignorance of the man she had insulted 2 days prior. "Arthur Penhaligon." 44205 Whispering Pine Court, Arthur said. His voice was steady. "I am here regarding the construction currently taking place behind my residence." "The community pavilion," Brenda corrected. "Go on. 2 minutes, 45 seconds. Arthur opened the folder. He pulled out a photocopy of the deed and a reduced-size print of the 1982 subdivision plat. He held them up. "Brenda, the excavation you ordered on Saturday is illegal," Arthur stated calmly. "I have here the original recorded plat from the County Registry of Deeds, Book 14, page 209. It clearly shows that the area you refer to as Common Area B is actually a drainage easement located entirely within the fee-simple boundaries of my lot." The room went quiet. Jerry wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. Brenda didn't blink. "Mr. Penhaligon, we've already discussed this. The board conducted a review last year. We have a digital map from the county GIS website that shows that land is community property. GIS maps are for tax assessment purposes only," Arthur countered, his surveyor training kicking in. "They contain a disclaimer stating they are not legal representations of property lines. This document," he tapped the paper, "is the legal representation. You are building a permanent structure on private property. If you pour that concrete, you are liable for damages. Is that a threat? Brenda snapped. It is a notification of liability, Arthur said. I am asking you to issue a stop work order immediately until a licensed surveyor can verify the pins. Brenda leaned into her microphone, creating a sharp feedback whine. Mr. Penhaligon, you have always resisted improvements to this neighborhood. You complained about the speed bumps, and now you're complaining about a park. The board has done its due diligence. We are not going to halt a $50,000 project because you have some dusty old papers you found in your attic. These aren't from my attic. They are certified copies from the courthouse, Arthur said, his voice hardening. Your time is up, Susan announced, looking at her stopwatch. I haven't finished, Arthur said. Thank you for your comments, Arthur, Brenda said loudly, drowning him out. Next item on the agenda. Arthur stood his ground for a moment. He looked at the board members. He saw the boredom in their eyes, the absolute certainty that they were untouchable. They viewed him as a nuisance, an obstacle to be managed, not a property owner with rights. If you proceed, Arthur said, leaning close to the mic, you do so at your own peril. Brenda banged the gavel. Order, please sit down, or you will be asked to leave. Arthur closed his folder. He didn't storm out. He walked back to his seat and sat down. He needed to hear what came next. Now, Brenda continued, smoothing her blouse, regarding the Zen garden, we have a slight issue with the weather forecast for next week. Heavy rains. To ensure the foundation sets properly, the contractor suggests we accelerate the pouring schedule. This will incur an overtime fee of $2,000, but it guarantees the structure is anchored before the mud sets in. I motion to approve the expedited schedule, Jerry said immediately. Seconded, Susan mumbled. All in favor? Brenda asked. Aye, the board chorused. Motion carries. Brenda slammed the gavel down. The foundation will be poured this Wednesday. Arthur watched them. They had just voted to fast-track their own destruction. They were rushing to bury concrete on his land, believing that once it was built, it would be too late for him to do anything about it. They were wrong. In property law, possession wasn't 9/10 of the law. The deed was everything. Arthur stood up and silently left the room. He had done his duty. He had given notice. Now he could take off the kid gloves. As he walked to his car in the dark parking lot, he took his phone out and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. Sarah, he said when the voice answered. It's Uncle Art. I hope you're not too busy at the firm. I have a case that's going to pay for your next vacation. The county recorder's office was located in the basement of the old courthouse, a place where the air was always cool and smelled faintly of ozone and dust. For Arthur, this was hallowed ground. While the world outside obsessed over tweets and trends, the truth in this room was written in ink and stamped in steel. He walked past the rows of computer terminals where amateurs looked up tax liens and headed straight for the heavy-bound volumes in the back. He didn't need the digital index. He knew the subdivision's history better than anyone. Arthur pulled Book 14, page 209 from the shelf. The binder was heavy, the leather spine cracked from decades of use. He carried it to a reading table and opened it carefully. There it was. The Oak Creek Estates original plat, recorded September 12, 1982. He ran a finger along the lot lines. Lot 41, Lot 42, his home, and behind it, the contested strip. On the yellowed paper, the lines were crisp. The area Brenda called Common Area B was clearly marked, but not as separate property. It was inside the boundary of Lot 42. A dashed line ran through it with the notation 20 Drainage and Utility Easement, DUE. Arthur took a high-resolution photo with his phone, then requested a certified, stamped copy from the clerk. An easement allowed the city to run pipes or the electric company to trim branches near lines. It did not grant the HOA the right to pour a concrete slab, build a gazebo, or host yoga classes. But Arthur needed to understand how Brenda had convinced the board otherwise. He needed to see their cards. He drove home, the certified roll of plans sitting on the passenger seat like a loaded weapon. Back in his study, he logged into the HOA's resident portal. Brenda prided herself on transparency, which meant she uploaded every self-congratulatory document to the cloud. Arthur navigated to the project's Zen Garden, Permits and Planning folder. He clicked on the file labeled Official survey site to plan.pdf. When the image loaded, Arthur actually laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound, unused to being made. It wasn't a survey. It wasn't even a professional site plan. It was a blown-up screenshot of the county tax map, the very map that carried a disclaimer saying it wasn't for legal use, with lines drawn over it in red marker. In the bottom right corner, where a licensed surveyor's seal should have been, there was a jagged signature, D. Miller, Miller Landscapes and Design. Arthur did a quick search on the state licensing board's website. Miller Landscapes was a lawn mowing company. D. Miller was Dave Miller, Brenda's brother-in-law. He held no surveyor's license, no civil engineering degree, and no liability insurance for grading work. Brenda hadn't just made a mistake. She had bypassed the entire legal requirement for a boundary survey to save money, likely funneling the landscaping contract to her family in the process. She was relying on a lawnmower guy's sketch to seize property worth tens of thousands of dollars. Arthur printed the documents. He placed the certified deed next to Dave Miller's red marker drawing. The contrast was pathetic. One was the law, the other was a child's drawing. His phone buzzed. It was Sarah. "Uncle Art," her voice was sharp, professional. "I reviewed the deed you scanned. You own it. Fee simple. The easement is strictly for utilities and drainage. If they build a structure there, they are blocking the flow of water, which is a code violation on top of the trespassing. They're pouring the foundation tomorrow," Arthur said, looking out the window. He could see the forms being set up by the workers. They were encroaching 6 feet past the easement line, deep into his backyard. "We can file for an emergency temporary restraining order," Sarah said. "I can get a judge to sign it by this afternoon." Arthur watched the workers. He saw Brenda standing there pointing at his azaleas, laughing at something the foreman said. She looked triumphant. "No," Arthur said softly. "No?" Sarah sounded confused. "Arthur, if they pour the concrete, it gets messier." "I want it messy," Arthur replied. "If we stop them now, they lose a few $100 on cancellation fees. They'll just move the project 10 feet to the left and harass me for the rest of my life. I need them to commit. I need them to spend the money. You want them to build it?" "I want them to finish it," Arthur said, his eyes cold. "I want the structure to be fully built, paid for, and celebrated. And then I want the court to order them to tear it down. I want the financial hit to be so severe that the neighborhood finally wakes up and fires the board." Sarah paused on the other end. "That is incredibly ruthless and legally risky. If you let them build, they might argue laches, that you waited too long to assert your rights." "I asserted my rights at the meeting yesterday," Arthur reminded her. "It's in the minutes. I warned them. They ignored me. I have the certified letter I sent them this morning confirming my objection. I'm not waiting. I'm letting them hang themselves." "Okay," Sarah said, a hint of admiration in her tone. "I'll draft the paperwork, but we don't file until you give the signal." "Get the master injunction ready," Arthur said. "I'll let you know when to pull the trigger." He hung up. Outside, the cement mixer truck was backing down the street, its reverse alarm beeping a rhythm of impending doom. Wednesday arrived with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. The cement mixers, 2 of them, were idling in the cul-de-sac by 7:30 a.m., their drums spinning with a hypnotic, grinding rhythm. Arthur stood at his kitchen window, drinking his coffee black. He watched as the heavy chute swung out, extending over the property line like the neck of a mechanical dinosaur. The gray slurry began to flow, burying the rich soil of his backyard under tons of wet aggregate and Portland cement. Brenda was there, of course. She was wearing a hard hat that looked pristine, likely purchased just for the photo ops. She was directing the crew, pointing at the wooden forms that encroached nearly 8 feet onto Arthur's land. "Make sure it's leveled flush with the tree line," she shouted, her voice carrying over the engine noise. Arthur flinched. The tree line she was referring to consisted of his prize-winning camellias, which the workers had hacked back with machetes an hour earlier to make room for the wooden framing. He picked up his camera. He didn't go outside to argue. He didn't wave his cane. He simply took photos through the glass. He zoomed in on the chute crossing the boundary markers. He photographed the workers stepping on his lawn. He photographed Brenda giving the thumbs up to the driver. Every pixel was a time-stamped record of willful negligence. By noon, the pour was finished. A massive gray slab now hardened in the sun, steaming slightly as the chemical reaction took hold. It was ugly, intrusive, and permanently scarred the natural landscape Arthur had curated for 30 years. But the physical insult was only the first half of the day's assault. At 2:00 p.m., the mail carrier arrived. She walked up Arthur's driveway looking apologetic. She knew the neighborhood gossip. "Certified mail, Mr. Penhaligon," she said, handing him a thick, rigid envelope. "Sign here, please." Arthur signed the electronic pad. He knew the return address without looking. Oak Creek HOA, Executive Board. He took the envelope into his study, sitting at his desk. He used a letter opener to slit the top, pulling out a stack of crisp, heavy stock paper. Brenda certainly didn't skimp on the stationery costs. The cover letter was a notice of violation. "Dear homeowner, it has come to the attention of the board that you have engaged in a pattern of disruptive behavior regarding the community improvement project, Zen Garden." Arthur flipped to the itemized invoice attached. Violation. 1. Verbal harassment of contracted vendors. Incident date Saturday. Fine. 250 euro. Violation. 2. Interference with community progress. Obstruction of common area maintenance. Fine. 500 euro. Violation. 3. Failure to maintain landscaping. Overgrown vegetation encroaching on community workspace. Fine. 150 $7. Administrative legal fee. Review of homeowner complaints. Charge. 4,350 $350 total. Due 5,250. Arthur stared at the number. They were charging him $4,000 because their lawyer had to read his objection letter. It was extortion, plain and simple. He read the bold text at the bottom. Failure to remit payment within 14 days will result in a lien being placed against the property at 4205 Whispering Pine Court. Continued non-payment may result in foreclosure proceedings initiated by the association to recover debts. They were threatening his home. They wanted to take his house because he asked them not to build on his land. Arthur felt a spike of adrenaline, a hot flush of anger that made his hands shake. He put the paper down and closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe. This was the reaction they wanted. They wanted him to storm over to Brenda's house, screaming and pounding on the door so they could call the police and file a restraining order. They wanted him to look like the crazy old man who couldn't handle progress. He opened his eyes. He picked up the phone and took a picture of the fine. He sent it to Sarah. Added to the pile, he texted. "Received," Sarah replied instantly. "This is retaliation. Highly illegal. The judge is going to love this. Do not pay it." Arthur looked out the window at the drying slab of concrete. It was hardening fast. By tomorrow, it would be stone. Brenda thought the concrete was the foundation of her legacy. She didn't realize she had just poured the headstone for her presidency. He opened his checkbook, but not to pay the fine. He wrote a check to Apex Geomatics, the forensic survey firm Sarah had recommended. "Tie the knot tight, Brenda," Arthur whispered to the empty room, "because you're going to hang by it." The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the fresh concrete. The silence returned to the backyard, but the atmosphere had changed. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was the heavy, charged silence of a battlefield right before the artillery opens fire. 2 weeks passed. The concrete cured, turning a pale bone white. Framing crews arrived, hammering expensive cedar beams into place. A slate roof was laid, tile by expensive tile. The Zen Garden was no longer a concept. It was a physical reality, costing the association tens of thousands of dollars. Arthur watched it all. He didn't yell. He didn't stand in the way of the trucks. He simply sat on his patio, drinking tea, occasionally taking a photograph of the progress. To the workers, he was just an old man who had accepted defeat. To Brenda, his silence was victory. She strutted across the job site daily, micromanaging the placement of ornamental boulders and Japanese maples. She had even ordered a custom brass plaque, the Brenda Miller Community Pavilion, dedication to excellence. On a crisp Tuesday morning, just 4 days before the scheduled grand opening, a white van with amber strobe lights pulled into Arthur's driveway. The logo on the side read, Apex Geomatics, forensic surveying and litigation support. Arthur met them at the door. The lead surveyor, a man named Davis who looked like he carved mountains for a living, shook Arthur's hand. Mr. Penhaligon, Sarah sent us. We're here to locate the corners and stake the line. Do you have the 1982 coordinates? Arthur asked. Loaded into the total station. Davis tapped the yellow device on his shoulder. We're going to find the original iron pins. If they're there, we'll find them. If they've been moved, we'll know that too. The team went to work with military precision. They didn't use tape measures. They used laser theodolites and GPS rovers connected to the state plane coordinate system. They moved through the brush like ghosts, locating the witness trees and the buried monuments. Arthur watched as Davis used a magnetic locator near the front of the property. The device screamed. Davis dug down 6 inches and exposed a rusty iron pipe, the original corner marker from 40 years ago. Found it, Davis called out. He set the tripod over it. Shooting the back line now. The laser cut a straight, invisible line through the air, directly toward the new pavilion. Brenda, spotting the unexpected crew, came storming over from the construction site. She was wearing her signature neon vest, looking flustered. Excuse me, she shouted, marching up to Davis. Who are you? You can't park here. This is a construction zone. Davis didn't look up from his eyepiece. I'm working for the property owner of Lot 42. Please step aside, ma'am. You're blocking the line of sight. I am the HOA president, Brenda announced, crossing her arms. And I did not authorize any survey work. We already have a site plan. Davis finally looked at her. He had the calm demeanor of someone who had testified in court 100 times. Ma'am, a site plan isn't a boundary survey, and unless you have a court order, you can't stop a licensed surveyor from locating property corners. Interfering with a survey marker is a Class 2 misdemeanor. I'd suggest you move. Brenda faltered. The legal terminology hit her like a splash of cold water. She stepped back, fuming, pulling out her phone to likely call the HOA lawyer, who was billing them $300 an hour. Davis turned to his assistant. Stake it. The assistant walked the line, carrying a bundle of bright orange wooden stakes and a can of neon pink spray paint. He walked past Arthur's azaleas. He walked up to the edge of the new concrete slab. He drove a stake into the ground right next to the foundation. Then he stepped onto the slab. Brenda gasped. Get off the concrete! That's fresh slate! The assistant ignored her. He consulted his data collector. The line went right through the middle of the structure. He shook the can of pink spray paint. Ksh, ksh. He sprayed a thick, bright neon line across the expensive slate floor of the pavilion. He sprayed it up the side of the cedar support column. He sprayed it across the Zen sand garden. What are you doing? Brenda shrieked. That's vandalism. That, Davis said calmly from the tripod, is the property line. Everything to the right of that paint belongs to Mr. Penhaligon. Everything to the left is yours. Arthur walked over, leaning on his cane. He looked at the line. It was devastating. The property line sliced off nearly 70% of the structure. The pavilion was sitting almost entirely in his backyard. You're making a mistake, Brenda yelled, her face turning a blotchy red. Our map says... Your map is wrong, Davis said, packing up his gear. I'll have the stamped plat ready by tomorrow morning. It will hold up in Supreme Court. Good day. The crew packed up and left. The silence that followed was heavy. Brenda stood in the middle of her masterpiece, staring at the neon pink line that defaced the floor. She looked at Arthur. You think this scares me? She hissed. It's just paint. I'll have the boys scrub it off. We're opening on Saturday, Arthur, and you're going to pay for the cleaning. Arthur smiled. It was a genuine smile this time. Go ahead, Brenda, he said softly. Scrub it off. Pretend it's not there. Finish the roof. Plant the flowers. I will, she snapped. Good, Arthur said, turning back to his house. I want it to look perfect for the demolition crew. He walked inside. The trap was sprung. She had been given undeniable professional proof that she was trespassing. By ignoring the survey stakes and scrubbing the paint, which he knew she would do, she was moving from negligence to willful and malicious trespassing. He picked up his phone. Sarah, he said, they staked it. She's scrubbing the paint off now. Prepare the sheriff. Saturday arrived with a sky so blue it looked painted. The weather was perfect for a grand opening, just as Brenda had promised. By 10 a.m., the cul-de-sac was lined with cars. A rental company had set up white folding chairs on the lawn. Arthur's lawn, though the guests didn't know that yet. Red, white, and blue balloons bobbed in the breeze, tied to the cedar posts of the newly finished pavilion. The smell of catered sliders and cheap sparkling wine wafted through the air. A three-piece jazz band played harmless, elevator-style music in the corner. Arthur stood at his bedroom window, dressed in his Sunday best, a charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a tie. He watched the neighbors milling about. They were drinking champagne on his property, admiring a structure built with stolen money on stolen land. He saw Brenda. She was wearing a cream-colored pantsuit, holding a glass of wine, beaming like a queen surveying her subjects. The neon pink spray paint from the surveyor had been scrubbed clean, leaving only faint, ghost-like abrasions on the slate floor if one knew where to look. She had tried to erase the truth. Arthur checked his watch. 10:15 a.m. "It's time," he murmured. He walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped out onto the porch. At the exact same moment, a black SUV with tinted windows turned the corner, followed closely by a sheriff's department cruiser. The cruiser didn't use its siren, but its blue lights were flashing, cutting through the bright sunlight with an urgent, strobe-like intensity. The jazz band faltered and stopped. The conversation in the crowd died down, replaced by the collective murmur of confusion. The vehicles pulled up to the curb, blocking the entrance to the park. Sarah stepped out of the SUV. She looked every inch the high-powered litigator, sharp blazer, briefcase, and a look of absolute determination. From the cruiser emerged two deputies. One was holding a roll of yellow tape. The other carried a heavy stack of documents. Brenda, realizing the attention had shifted, marched down the grassy slope to meet them. She held her wine glass like a weapon. "Officers," she called out, her voice shrill in the sudden silence. "We are in the middle of a private community event. Unless you have a noise complaint, I'm going to have to ask you to move your vehicle." The lead deputy, a man named Sergeant Miller, no relation, Arthur noted with irony, ignored her. He looked past her to Sarah. "This the location, counselor?" "Yes, Sergeant," Sarah said, her voice projecting clearly to the silent crowd. The structure labeled Zen Garden and the surrounding 20 feet of landscaping. "What is going on?" Brenda demanded, stepping into Sarah's path. "Who are you?" Sarah didn't flinch. She pulled a thick sheaf of papers from her briefcase. "Brenda Miller, I am Sarah Penhaligon, attorney for Arthur Penhaligon. You have been served electronically, but since you blocked my client's emails, I am serving you personally." She thrust the papers into Brenda's free hand. Brenda instinctively grabbed them, nearly dropping her wine. "This is an emergency injunction and temporary restraining order signed by Judge Holloway this morning," Sarah announced, turning slightly so the board members could hear. "It orders the immediate cessation of all activity on Lot 42. It names you, the HOA board, and all guests as defendants in a civil trespass suit." "Trespass?" Brenda laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "This is common area." "The court disagrees," Sarah said cold. "The judge has reviewed the certified survey. You have built a structure on private property. As of this moment, this is an active crime scene of malicious trespass and destruction of property." The sergeant stepped forward. "Ma'am, I need everyone to clear the area immediately. We are seizing the structure as evidence." "You can't do that," Brenda screamed, her composure cracking. "We have a permit. We have a ribbon cutting. You have 5 minutes to vacate the premises before I start writing citations for criminal trespassing," the sergeant said, his hand resting on his belt. He turned to the second deputy. "Tape it off." The crowd gasped. The second deputy marched up the hill, walking right past the stunned jazz band. He took the roll of yellow tape, marked "Do Not Enter," and began wrapping it around the beautiful cedar columns of the pavilion. He wrapped it around the refreshments table. He wrapped it around the balloons. The neighbors, realizing the party was over, began to scatter. No one wanted to be named in a lawsuit. They set down their wine glasses and hurried toward their cars, leaving Brenda alone on the lawn. "Wait, don't go!" Brenda shouted at the fleeing guests. "It's just a misunderstanding. It's a clerical error." "It's a felony level of property damage, ma'am," Sarah corrected her. "And since you were notified of the boundary line before you poured the foundation, the good faith defense is off the table. You are personally liable. Arthur finally walked down the driveway. He moved slowly, his cane tapping a steady rhythm on the asphalt. He stopped next to Sarah. Brenda looked at him, her eyes wide with shock and fury. She looked at the yellow tape desecrating her masterpiece. She looked at the court order in her hand. You let us build it, she whispered, the realization finally hitting her. You watched us spend the money. I told you to stop, Arthur said softly. I told you at the meeting. I told you in the letter. I told you when the surveyor was here. He looked up at the pavilion, now wrapped in police tape like a murder scene. Now, Arthur said, get off my land. The sergeant stepped between them. Ms. Miller, you need to leave the property. Now. Defeated, Brenda turned and walked away, her heels sinking into the soft turf she had paid to have laid just days ago. Arthur stood with his niece and the deputies. The silence returned to the cul-de-sac, but this time, it was the silence of total victory. The wind blew and the yellow tape fluttered against the fresh cedar, the only decoration left for the grand opening. The wheels of justice turned slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. In the weeks following the shutdown of the pavilion, the neighborhood of Oak Creek transformed from a quiet suburb into a hostile environment. The Zen garden sat rotting behind yellow police tape, a constant, ugly reminder of the standoff. The Homeowners Association called an emergency meeting, but this time, there were no cookies and no speeches about community synergy. The reserve fund was frozen. The insurance company, upon seeing the police report and the survey, had sent a reservation of rights letter, essentially warning the board that if this was found to be an intentional illegal act, the insurance policy would not cover their legal fees. Arthur sat in the conference room of Sarah's law firm downtown for the deposition phase. Across the long mahogany table sat Brenda, Jerry the treasurer, and their visibly exhausted attorney, a man named Mr. Henderson, who looked like he regretted taking the retainer. The air in the room was recycled and dry. A court reporter sat at the end of the table, her fingers hovering over her stenotype machine. Ms. Miller, Sarah began, her voice deceptively light. You stated in your initial response that the encroachment onto Mr. Penhaligon's land was an honest mistake caused by ambiguous maps. Is that correct? Brenda sat stiffly. She had lost weight. The arrogance was replaced by a brittle defensiveness. Yes, the county maps are very confusing. We acted in good faith. Sarah nodded slowly. She picked up a document from her stack. It was a printed email chain. I'd like to enter Exhibit D into the record, Sarah said, sliding the paper across the table. This is an email thread between yourself and the foreman of the concrete company, dated 3 days before the foundation was poured. Mr. Henderson snatched the paper, reading it quickly. His face paled. He looked at Brenda, then closed his eyes briefly. Sarah read aloud for the record. On Tuesday, the foreman wrote, Ms. Miller, we found a metal pin near the oak tree that suggests the property line is tight. We recommend pausing for a survey verification. Sarah looked up, and your reply, sent 20 minutes later via your iPhone, was, ignore the pin. It's old junk. We are on a schedule. If you don't pour by Wednesday, I will terminate your contract and hire someone else. The room went dead silent. The hum of the building's HVAC system suddenly seemed very loud. Did you write this email, Miss Miller? Sarah asked. Brenda shifted in her chair. I was under a lot of pressure. The rainy season was coming. You didn't think the property line mattered? Sarah interrupted. Or you didn't care? I thought he was trying to price gouge us, Brenda snapped. Contractors always try to find reasons to delay. So to clarify, Sarah pressed, you were explicitly warned by a construction professional that you might be crossing a boundary line, and you threatened to fire him if he didn't proceed? That is not negligence, Miss Miller. That is malice. That is willful intent. Jerry, the treasurer, let out a small, strangled noise. He raised his hand. I didn't see that email, Jerry blurted out. Brenda never showed the board that email. She told us the contractor gave the green light. Jerry, shut up, Brenda hissed. No, I won't shut up. Jerry turned to their lawyer. If she lied to the contractor, does that mean the board is liable? Because I voted based on the information she gave us. Mr. Henderson sighed, rubbing his temples. It means, Mr. Treasurer, that the business judgment rule, which protects board members from personal liability, might not apply here. If Ms. Miller acted outside of her authority or withheld material facts, the association, and specifically Ms. Miller, could be on the hook for punitive damages. Sarah leaned back. She didn't need to shout. The shark had smelled blood, and the feeding frenzy had begun. The board was turning on itself. "We have more," Sarah said, flipping the page. "We also have the invoices from Miller Landscapes for the grading work. Can you explain why the check for the site preparation was deposited into a joint bank account shared by you and your brother-in-law?" Brenda went pale. This was the second blow. Not only was she a tyrant, but she was also seemingly funneling community money into her family's pocket. "That was for services rendered," Brenda defended weakly. "He gave us a discount. He gave you a drawing that cost the association $50,000 in legal fees and counting," Sarah countered. Arthur watched quietly from the corner. He saw the realization dawn on Brenda. She wasn't just going to lose the lawsuit. She was going to lose her position, her reputation, and likely a significant amount of her own money. The insurance company would drop her the moment they saw that email. The deposition ended an hour later. As they packed up, Mr. Henderson approached Sarah. "Can we talk settlement?" he asked in a low voice. "My clients are motivated." "No settlement," Arthur said, speaking for the first time. Mr. Henderson looked at him. "Mr. Penhaligon, surely we can work out an easement agreement. The association is willing to pay a premium for the land." "I don't want your money," Arthur said, buttoning his jacket. "I want my land back. I want the structure gone. I want the soil restored. And I want Brenda's resignation letter framed on my wall." He walked out of the room, leaving the wolves to eat their own. The court hearing was next, but the war was already won. All that was left was the surrender. The sound of the diesel engine returned to the neighborhood of Oak Creek 3 months later. It was the same low, guttural roar that had started the nightmare, but this time, the rhythm was different. It wasn't the sound of invasion, it was the sound of correction. Arthur sat on his patio, a steaming mug of tea in his hand. The weather had turned. Autumn was bleeding into winter, stripping the leaves from the trees and leaving the neighborhood gray and exposed. Across the property line, the Brenda Miller Community Pavilion stood condemned. It looked pathetic now, a monument to hubris wrapped in tatters of sun-bleached police tape. But today the tape was coming down, not for a party, but for a funeral. A demolition crew, contracted by the court-appointed receiver now managing the HOA's finances, moved in. They didn't bring shovels or trowels. They brought a hydraulic breaker and a grapple truck. Arthur watched as the metal claw of the excavator reached out. It clamped onto the expensive cedar roof beams, the ones Brenda had insisted be imported from the Pacific Northwest. With a sickening crunch of splintering wood, the machine ripped the roof off the structure like a child opening a present. The slate tiles, each one costing $5, shattered into dust as they hit the concrete slab below. Standing on the sidewalk, a small group of neighbors watched in grim silence. They weren't mourning the loss of the park. They were mourning their bank accounts. The court ruling had been absolute. Judge Holloway had not only ordered the immediate removal of the encroaching structure, but he had also awarded Arthur punitive damages for willful and malicious trespass. To pay for the demolition, the legal fees, and the reforestation of Arthur's land, the HOA had been forced to levy a special assessment of $3,200 on every household in the community. Every time the excavator crunched into the building, the neighbors heard the sound of their own money being incinerated. Brenda was not there to watch. She had resigned in disgrace 2 days after the deposition, citing health reasons, though everyone knew the truth. The rumors were that she was putting her house on the market, unable to face the glare of the neighbors she had bankrupted. The hydraulic breaker hammer was attached to the excavator now. It positioned itself over the thick concrete foundation, the slab Brenda had poured in such a rush to beat the rain. Rat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat. The noise was deafening, a jackhammer staccato that shook the windows. Arthur didn't mind. It was the music of justice. Cracks spiderwebbed across the gray surface. The permanent foundation was being pulverized back into gravel. By late afternoon, the structure was gone. The slate, the cedar, The brass plaque, all of it was in a dumpster, hauled away to the landfill. All that remained was a raw, muddy scar on the earth. But the court order was specific. Restoration, the judge had written. 2 days later, a landscaping crew arrived. They weren't the Miller Landscapes crew. These were professionals hired by Arthur, paid for by the HOA's insurance bond. They worked for 3 days. They tilled the compacted soil. They brought in truckloads of rich, dark organic compost. And then the flatbed trucks arrived carrying the trees. Mature white oaks and Carolina pines, their root balls wrapped in burlap, heavy and ancient. They were expensive, prohibitively so, but the court had ordered that the land be returned to its prior condition, which meant replacing 40-year-old trees with 40-year-old trees. Arthur pointed with his cane, directing the placement. He watched as the cranes lowered the giants into the earth, filling the gap in the canopy, restoring the privacy wall that had protected his home for decades. When the last truck finally pulled away, silence returned to Lot 42. Arthur walked out to the edge of his property. The new sod was soft under his feet. The trees stood tall, blocking the view of the cul-de-sac. The common area was gone. The Zen garden was a memory. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, new brass marker. He knelt down and hammered it into the ground, flush with the grass, right where the old iron pin had been found. It was a surveyor's cap, stamped with his own license number. He stood up, his hip popping slightly, and looked at the line. It was invisible to the naked eye, but to him, it was a fortress wall that would never be breached again. He turned and walked back toward his house. He had a lot of reading to do. The new HOA board had just sent over the draft bylaws for review, and this time, they had asked for his permission first. Arthur smiled. It was good to be home.